So let's move on to the next talk, which is Statistical Issues in Development Decision Support Tools. Dr. Brian Tom from the Cambridge University MRC Biostatistics Unit, who works in the area of precision medicine. So we look forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation from Christine and from Mew. I was actually quite surprised, actually, that I was invited because I don't do anything on pharmacogenomics. So I know very little about pharmacogenomics, but I do know about precision medicine and stratified medicine. And I have some experience in developing risk prediction models and decision support tools. I thought it would be good, actually, to start off by describing what a decision support tool is. And I use the definition from NHS England. And I should also say that I'm talking about decision support tools in the context of healthcare, because you could think of it more broadly. And I'm thinking about it in the context of precision medicine in terms of tailoring and individualizing the treatment to patients based on potentially a wealth of data that is available to the clinicians. So the NHS England's definition of decision support tool, or described decision support tools, as aids that support shared decision-making by making treatment care and support options explicit. They provide evidence-based information about the associated benefits and harms and helps patients to consider what matters most to them in relation to the possible outcomes, including doing nothing. And I highlighted a number of words there. Support. So a decision support tool, as it says, is not there to replace a clinician or replace the discussion between the clinician and the patient. It's there to aid the discussion. So it's really important to recognize that. The decision-making needs, by making treatment care and support options explicit, it needs to be transparent, okay? And these decision support-based tools should be evidence-based and factor in the benefits as well as the harms of using that decision support tool. And preference is also a key thing. It has to matter to both the clinician and to the patient. In particular, whatever decision comes out, it has to be a discussion between the patient and the clinician. So preference may come into it as well. So a decision support tool really aims to provide timely and effective use of available patient-specific information at key decision points to assist the clinician and patients make informed decisions about the best course of care. There are different types of decision support tools. So there's a spectrum. And they range from kind of assistive predictive rules, things that I think of as like risk prediction models that provide predicted probabilities or levels of risk of a clinical condition or prognosis or the progression of a disease, the risk of progression of disease, so a future outcome, without necessarily recommending any particular action. So for example, questions like, what is the probability that a patient will survive 5 years based on their individual profile and their current treatment? So implicit in these kind of models is that something should be done if identified as high risk, but they don't explicitly tell you what the decision to make is. They leave that up to the doctor, the clinicians, and the patients. So it ranges from assistive predictive rules, but also to directive or prescriptive decision rules that directly relate risk to actions. And they aim either to predict the outcome of these actions or to recommend the optimal action, so thereby directly influencing behavior. For example, what treatment should a patient take to maximize or optimize their 5-year survival based on their individual profile? So a couple of examples that a number of you probably are aware of. There's the Q-RISK-3 calculator, which calculates a person's risk of developing a heart attack or stroke over the next 10 years under current practice or guidelines. And Q-RISK-3 in itself does not tell you what about decisions, but NICE has used it to decide whether to initiate statins if you're considered high risk And I'll come back to the QRIS-3 example later on. There's also Predict Breast Cancer, which is an online tool that helps patients and clinicians see how different treatments for early invasive breast cancer might improve survival rates after surgery. So this is much more used to actually decide what treatments to give patients. And it does this by actually comparing various options that are available to patients. So it looks at all these hypothetical options of treatments and what the results of these treatments would be if they were taken up. There's also Predict Prostate as well. What I also find really interesting, if you do a literature review, you find tons and tons of examples, a plethora of examples of clinical prediction models across many different areas and conditions. And most of these models, let's just say about 95, 99% of these models don't get implemented, don't get adopted. And you kind of think, why? Why is this the case? And I'll just give a couple of reasons. Firstly, they're not usually properly rigorously developed. They're based on a preliminary analysis of a certain data set and it doesn't go beyond that. So it's very hard for it to get adopted because it hasn't shown that it's generalizable or transportable to other settings and to other patient populations. And most of the case, sometimes these models are just not fit for purpose. They don't answer the question that they purport to answer, to be trying to answer. And I'll come back to about, this whole talks about developing a risk prediction model, clinical decision support system tool. And so I'll come back to how you do that in the next few slides. But I also wanted to just, as an aside, talk about what makes a decision support tool successful. Well, I would say that it has to be routinely used. It has to be adopted on a wide scale, whether it be internationally, European, in the European or more nationally. It has to be widely adopted for its purpose. And it has to contribute to making patient lives better. So, when you come to developing a decision support tool, there are a number of stages to development of this decision support tool. And I like to define these stages as, I like to consider these stages as kind of 5 different processes. So first of all, you need to define the question and understand whether there is a need. And I'll come back to that afterwards. You need to derive the decision support tool, and that's where mostly the statisticians come in. You need to externally validate and refine the decision support tool. You need to understand how it will impact on clinical practice and whether it was cost effective. And that's what raised just recently earlier on in the discussion about cost effectiveness. And you need to also think about the long-term implementation and the dissemination of this tool. And at each of these stages, there are statistical issues to address. So, the first stage, defining the question and understanding the need. So, before a decision support tool can be derived, we need to understand what exactly are the clinical questions the tool aims to address. And we also need to understand if there's a need for such a tool and clearly justify why it is needed. Now, different tools are designed to answer different questions. For example, what is the risk without being treated? What is the risk before being treated? What is the risk under clinical practice? What is the best treatment strategy to adopt at this point of time to optimize clinical utility? And which treatment should be given to whom? So there's lots of different questions that these decision support tools can try to answer. Therefore, it's important to align clinical question with the development of the tool so that there are no discrepancies between development and use. So, before a decision tool can be derived, as I said, we need to understand what exactly are the clinical questions we aim to address. And here's an example where there's a discrepancy between the development and use, and this relates to QRIS-3. So, the NICE guidelines recommend that clinicians, to consider prescribing or initiating statins to patients, they need to have a risk based on the Q-risk calculator of over 10%. However, Q-risk-3, although developed on a baseline statin-naive cohort, allowed patients to commence statins during 10-year follow-up in their derivation cohort. So the calculated risk are for a population where some patients will receive statins during follow-up. So if statins are, let's just say statins are effective in reducing CVD risk and CVD events, the risk estimated by Q-risk-3 will actually be lower than the risk for a patient who will not be treated during follow-up. So the risk estimated will be lower. Thus underestimating the true untreated risk and thereby leading to undertreatment of new high-risk patients. And this is because predicted risk of some of these patients may be lower than 10%. They're predicted or they're estimated when actually it is actually above 10%. Because, for example, maybe similar patients in the derivation cohort may have received statins really early on and which had reduced their risk of having the CVD event. So we need to be actually aware of how the model was developed aligns with the question that or the purpose is going to be used for or intended to be used for. We should also understand if there's an actual need for such a tool in the first place, and we should really justify why it is needed. For example, when decision-making is challenged, so for example, when a decision support may be needed is where decision-making is actually challenging and clinicians are failing to make the most appropriate decision, which may lead on to possibly serious consequences. You might consider developing a decision support tool to actually speed up the decision-making process and make the healthcare decision system more efficient. You might have to use a decision support tool to prioritize patients when there's limited resources. And you might also want to consider whether the decision support tools out there that already aim to do the same thing, whether there are decision support tools out there that already aim to do the same thing. And instead of developing a new decision support tool, maybe you can consider validating, updating, or testing the impact of these existing tools. Somebody mentioned literature review in the first talk. And so I would also advocate that it's important to conduct a systematic review of the literature and maybe worth also conducting a qualitative study or a focus group to assess clinical relevance, credibility, and acceptability of the question and the tool that you want to develop. I would say that, and the previous speaker mentioned, that decisions to support tools must be developed to meet strict methodological standards. And some of the things that you need to consider when doing that is, first of all, the study design. Okay, whether the study design should be prospective, retrospective, should it be a RCT, a randomized controlled trial? Can we get away with using cross-sectional data, or do we need longitudinal data? Should we have adopt a multi-center approach? And also, it's important to think about whether our data that we're going to use is representative of the population that we're interested in using the tool on. We need to think about whether these things have clear decision points. We need to think about the data, whether the data set is large enough for the purposes that we want, whether there's enough events that will allow us to build robust predictive models or clinical decision support tools. We need to think about what are the variables and outcomes that we should be considering. For example, it's no point developing a model based on some really complicated and set of variables which we don't use in clinical practice, and it's only available in research settings. Okay. So we should be thinking about routinely collected data, whether these whether these variables and outcomes are expensive, whether they are quality assured, and whether they are reliable. We need to also think about the definition of outcomes. Does the outcome that we're going to use in developing the models consistent with the outcome we're going to use in clinical practice? We need to also think about whether the outcome is not just one outcome, but it's multiple outcomes, whether there's a benefit, safety, and elemented or adverse outcome and a benefit outcome to this. And maybe we need to think about utilities and maybe even building in cost effectiveness into it and patient's preference. We need to also think about the statistical approaches that we need to adopt. We can go relatively standard types of statistical methodology like logistic regression and survival analysis. It's a much more complicated and much more state-of-the-art type methodology based on dynamic prediction, AI methods. We need to also think about potentially causal frameworks and dealing with a multitude of different variables. So we need to think also about variable selection. But we should already do this tailored to the context in which the tool will be used. We also should think about missing data. Some of the other things we should also consider is what are the performance measures are we going to use to decide whether our tool is doing a good job, is robust, is performing well, it's accurate. So there's a list of these kind of tool performance measures out there: area under the curve, C-index. We might want to look at calibration, discrimination, clinical utility. But what I would say is that we should really appropriately choose a measure which is consistent with what the purposes of it, what tool is. We should also think about internal validation, because as we know that a lot of the tools we develop are over-optimistic, so we should have some level of internal validation to adjust for over-optimism. One of the things that wasn't mentioned directly, but I think you alluded to it, was when you talked about inclusivity, was fairness. Okay? And we don't want a decision tool which reinforces historical biases. That's not a good thing. And therefore put disadvantaged groups at greater risk. We also want decision tools which are, in the most part, possibly, if we can, interpretable and explainable. So there's a trade-off between complexity and interpretability that we need to balance. And these models should be transparent, as well as the process of developing these models should be transparent. There should be kind of a trail, a provenance to how these decision recommendations were made based on our models and how these models were developed. We should also think about how these things will be implemented in practice and how we should design them so that they are easy to use in practice. We now come on to the next stage, which is external validation and refinement. And as I mentioned before, decision support tools perform better in data sets that they derived in. Therefore, we expect worse performance on external validation. And this is typically due to the overfitting in the derivation data set, potentially also due to case mix differences between the derivation data set and where we're going to use it on, where we try to externally validate it in. Also, it may be actually to do with just the fact that the prevalence of the condition that we're interested in is different in the two different data sets. And it's also maybe the case that we have absence of important predictors or differences in how variables are defined and or measured in the new data set which we're going to use for external validation. So there's no guarantee that the derived decision support tool will be generalizable or transportable to these different populations. Therefore, it's actually really important to do this external validation to actually ensure that these models are fit for purpose. There are different types of external validation. So you could externally validate it temporarily. So we use the same population, but we look at a future time point over a different time period, and we validate it that way. We could try to validate it geographically. So we build it in one center. We try to see how it performs in various other centers across the country. we might actually even change the domain set or the setting that we try to validate this model on. So maybe we look at different age groups. We look, instead of in primary settings, we look at secondary settings. So, and it's worth noting that the expected performance will be more affected the further external validation cohorts are from the derivation cohorts. So you would expect maybe with temporal validation that it will be more closer to the derivation data set than maybe when you change the setting altogether and you look at different age groups. And if there are other tools out there already, we should compare our decision support tool to those tools as well and compare and contrast their performances. Now, if the actual performance measures on our external validation indicate that our model is performing badly on external validation, there's a number of options we can take. We might need to actually update or recalibrate our tool, or potentially we can have to start all over again, okay? And I would just like to say that also you need to report rigorously the external validation study that you performed. Again, regarding provenance and transparency. We also need to think about how these decision tools will impact on clinical practice. So no matter how well your decision support tool performs under validation conditions, this doesn't mean it will work well when transported into clinical practice, into the real world setting. You mentioned alerts and ignoring alerts, for example. So the impact of decision support tools in clinical practice will depend on the kind of complex interactions between the healthcare system, the patients, the clinicians, the whole system in general, and the tool itself. And you can think of it in terms of various aspects: the operational characteristics of the tool, the acceptability by clinicians and physicians and patients, the ease of which it can be used, the flexibility and the appropriateness of its use, the interpretability and explainability of the recommendations made, and the ability for it to demonstrate added clinical value over the usual clinical care judgments. And also things like whether it's going to be implementable or cost-effective. I would say that impact analysis studies correspond to the highest level of evidence and gives a more realistic picture of how the tool will perform. So it's crucial to do this step. And it's very unfortunate that very few impact analyses are performed in practice. Maybe it's because the bar to get to the stage is very high already. So the tool has to be rigorously derived and broadly validated according to predefined methodological standards first. It might actually be expensive to do or infeasible to do these impact studies. And I would recommend that if you're going to do an impact study, you should actually do it across multiple settings. And there are various possible comparative designs for impact analysis studies, including kind of things like clustered randomized trials and step wedge designs. And it would be very useful if there were published guidelines for impact studies or decision support tools. Finally, long-term implementation and dissemination. The gap between evidence and uptake into clinical practice has been consistently demonstrated. As I said, there's no guarantee that a decision support tool will be widely used, even if it's shown to have added value and even cost benefit over usual case. So therefore, to maximize uptake, one must be proactive with regard to dissemination and implementation strategies. You need to actively engage with relevant stakeholders, the clinicians, the patients, NICE, NHS purchases, the GP practices, the regulatory bodies, etc. You also need to think about targeted strategies and promotion to increase awareness. You need to identify the barriers and facilitators to implementation. And I would just like to end by saying what are the keys to a successful decision support tool. There must be a need. It must be properly planned and designed. It must be derived under using appropriate statistical techniques and externally validated and assessed for impact and made transparent and fair. They must have clear clinical decision points and have input variables that are routinely used in clinical practice. It must be easy to use and should aim to be explainable. And ultimately needs to demonstrate added value over clinical judgment or usual care or better performance than existing tools. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? So maybe I can start off. What you've talked about are tools, which are usually based on one aspect, like this Q-risk-3. But what we're talking about here is a system, and embedded within that system, there may be 40 drugs with 40 different decision tools in that system. So actually doing all the stuff that you just talked about for the whole system is actually quite difficult. Yes. It's probably undoable. Yes. So can you just comment on that?
I think you have to take a more modular approach in that context. I think you may have to assess one or two of them together and how they interact in pairwise, but not necessarily. It will become very difficult to
but assess. To be able to get into the decision support system, you will have to have a lot of evidence base to be able to put it in there. So some of that evidence is already there, and then you're developing a system which allows you to be able to help with the decision to make in terms of prescribing.
Yeah, I suppose also what you need to do also is to, in a sense, interrogate various aspects of the system and see what kind of, in a sense, what the consequences of making wrong decisions at those points would have on the whole system in general. Yeah. And see how it feeds through in this. These are really complicated systems. It reminds me of, in a sense, like a genetic network where you intervene on somewhere and there is redundancy somewhere else. So you intervene somewhere else, but it doesn't necessarily change anything else because there's redundancy already built into the system where you catch these mistakes early on because of something else that you looked at.
Okay. Please.
Hi, Brian. Thank you very much for this talk. You mentioned many times the word need. We need. We have to. So, but how we can measure the need? And the need of clinicians sometimes is different of the need of the patients. So, it needed to understand at this point how to measure, how to introduce this kind of measure in the context.
I definitely agree. It has to be a discussion between the clinicians, the patients, and all the stakeholders that are involved in trying to define exactly what you mean by need. And then translate that into when you develop the statistical model. So it has to be fit for purpose. I totally agree with you.
Thanks.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Tom. I'm Viday. I'm a clinician and lecturer in health informatics from Manchester. Thank you for a really, really interesting talk. I had a question about data sets, and with the increased use of data sets at HDR UK or Open Safely or the UK Biobank, do you think we're moving away from single center databases for the development of models, and do you think that this improves the accuracy as well as that external validation point that you talked about as we try to develop new tools? What do you think the role is of those?
I think there is a role for those, but I will just qualify it by saying you need to understand those data sets. You need to understand those data sets properly, because there are inherent biases in a lot of these data sets. And if you use these data sets without thinking about these biases, you could potentially go really wrong. So you really need to think about these data sets, how they were collected, why they were collected, what are the potential inherent biases that are there in the data set. So maybe they're not even representative of the population you're interested in at all, but they collect all the information that you want. So you develop a model there, and then when you transport it to your setting that you're really interested in, it doesn't work at all because this population is totally different. I think these data sets are really useful because of the wealth of information that they're there, especially things like electronic health records. But there are features of the data set that you need to take account of. One of the examples with electronic health records that I have is the side of clinical presence, for example, that patients only come into the system when they need help. So it might actually be totally different from the population that you're interested in.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank
That's
you.
great. Thank you.